In my video on Leman Russ, we went into detail about the Primarch of the Space Wolves, but there was something we loosely touched on that I want to expand on more in this video. And that is the original Jarls, Thanes, and essentially bannermen of Leman Russ. These faithful Russians, Fenrisians, whatever it is, that end up becoming the 13th Great Company. So what we're going to discuss today is the expansion of that history of the lauded Frangi Guard, which some of the more keen listeners were able to draw a parallel to our own history's Phrygian Guard, the elite unit that acted as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors as early as 874 AD up to the 14th century. And the original kind of 6,000 being comprised of men from Rus. And I see what you did there, Games Workshop, you cheeky history-stealing sons of bitches. And feel free to correct me. I know in history it's R-U-S apostrophe, so I don't know if that is Rus or if that is Russ. An interesting thing I actually noticed if you play Battlefield Gothic 2, they say for Leman Rus, which I've been fucking playing this hobby for 20 years. He's always been Leman Russ to me. So let's get into this balls deep of the rise and fall of the 13th Great Company. Now our story begins with the Emperor having revealed himself to Leman Russ after their many trials during a grand feast. And I'm going to stick with that Leman Russ thing. Until someone proves me otherwise that it's Rus, it's Russ. So from there, the Emperor charged Leman with joining the Great Crusade, giving him command of the newly renamed Space Wolves Legion. And Russ's sword brothers, who had, of course, sworn an oath to their liege, agreed to take part in the ritual to become an Astartes or Astartes. Now, these weren't burgeoning young chaps, picked from the cream of the crop poised for a full-ride football scholarship. These were older, seasoned fighters, grizzled, grim, and resolute. The Emperor was pretty discouraging of it, but they persisted. And there's this kind of imagery that kind of comes to mind of these older Nordic-looking men, badasses having convened this council where they unanimously decide to go through with the process. Maybe one of them is the more outspoken and lighthearted of the group and assures a worried Russ that they'll be fine. They've gone through much worse before. I'm overly romanticizing this, but I'm sure they approach this with, unabashed fervor for what they thought would probably be a simple ordeal. The book doesn't really exactly pinpoint how many started the trials of the wolf, but it says hundreds, quote unquote, started and only 2 score survived. Now that's something in the neighborhood of 40 some odd men. And the survivors were banded into an elite company that was called Greybeards by the other legionnaires. The company called themselves Wolf Brothers. That's not to be confused with a successor chapter of the Space Wolves called the Wolf Brothers. So don't get it twisted. The man that led this company was Joran Bloodhowl, the very first Jarl of Dektra, the 13th. Joran had already established himself as a member of Russ's OG honor guard, Wolftaraj, the Einherjar. Please feel free to correct me on the pronunciation. I am not of Nordic descent, or Bloodsworn, as they are called. And these individuals made up the council that advised and ruled alongside Russ before the Great Crusade. So with this, you get a huge chunk of ancient Fenrisian tradition entering the Wolk of Fenrica even at its initial inception. And I mentioned this in the Primarch video, but this rich history that the Wolf Brothers brought helped ensure the synthesis of Terran-born members of the 6th Legion and the Fenrisian-born elements of the new Space Wolves. And of course, this story is going to start taking a bleak and obvious turn, like a played-out episode of Pretty Little Liars, which I swear to God I don't watch every goddamn night on Netflix. Who the fuck is A? Will we even know? Whew. Okay, moving on. Now, the Space Wolves have a name for their gene seed, or should I say it's more the traits that are associated with their gene seed. This is the Canis Helix. So, sprouting canines, that grow with age, acute hearing, enhanced sense of smell, being startled by your own farts. All of this stems from Russ's gene seed. And with that comes the crux of the helix, as I call it. I call it the crux of the helix. The actual name for it is the mark of the wolfen. So if the Blood Angel's red thirst turns them essentially into vampires, then the mark of the wolfen turns the rout into werewolves. And this usually manifests itself when an aspiring Marine is a neophyte. He's kind of going through their initial trial of the wolf, as it's called. And when we read the William King books, the Space Wolves Space Wolves books by William King, we see that this does happen when Ragnar Blackmane is becoming a Space Wolf. One of his peers falls victim to the curse of the wolfen and the mark of the wolfen, and he becomes one and actually stalks his own fellow neophytes. So that's typically when it is rooted out, and we don't hear many stories of the older Space Wolves falling victim to the wolfen curse. In fact, in the Battle of the Fang, which is one of the very first sieges of Fenris, there's like been 3 or 4 throughout history, the wolfen are used, they're kind of recalled up from the depths of the Fang itself with Bjorn Fellhand, the dreadnought at the time. They bring them up through like the whole depths of everything, and they release these wolfen into the fray to help combat and save Fenris. So it's a pretty cool moment here. But getting back on track, sometime early in their deployments, the 13th Company fell victim to this curse more so than other companies. I mean, there was an example of 2 individuals falling victim to it way after the fact. So perhaps it was because of their older age, or maybe something flawed in their initiation process. But either way, the 13th Great Company was able to hide this from not only the rest of the Legion, but from Leman Russ himself. And the company continued to serve throughout the Crusade, taking place in the first siege of Methrix, the Battle of the Plains of Moshan, the fall of the Paramours of the Morpheus Rift, and of course, the fall of Prospero. And without getting into the political intrigue and lead up to the besieging of the Thousand Suns home planet, it's needless to say that the 13th Company took part in the brutal assault of their brother's world. At the forefront of every engagement, the 13th threw themselves upon the shields of Thousand Suns, using their wolfen to break the will and back of the enemy, which is in no way a nod to the later backbreak that would happen to Magnus himself. But this is where the story sort of splits. In one version of the lore, the 13th Great Company sows some, pretty deep-seated vows of hate towards the Thousand Suns and pursues that, they promise, hey, we'll pursue them after they vanish into the warp at the behest of old One-Eye, the fleshy Epine of the warp, Magnus himself. And I'm not sure I really believe this version, to be honest. And I mean, even Wolflord Bolvi makes it sound like this isn't really how things went down when talking to Ragnar Blackmane when they come back from being in the warp. Now, the path I choose to believe is the one set up by Leman Russ after the Horus Heresy. So, once Horus is slain and the traitor legions are in flight to the Eye of Terror, they're essentially burning their way across the galaxy. And for the Primarchs and legions that weren't present at the Siege of Terra, their honor is pretty stained. Leman Russ, for one, feels as if he let the Emperor down. And the closer we get to this point in the Horus Heresy book series, the more we're really going to find out. But as of the making of this video, the lore only has the Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, and White Scars present, as far as Primarchs with their legions. I mean, there are other elements of other legions on Terra during the Siege of Terra, but those are the only 3 main legions that we know of that were fighting at that time. So, after the Siege of Terra, Dorn and Guilliman are trying to patch up the rest of the Imperium to kind of start the time of rebirth, which is the stage shortly after that siege, or the Horus Heresy as it were. And the consensus is to corral all of the traitors and stuff them into the Eye of Terror in a huge act known as the Great Scouring. That they just want to, they'll deal with them later kind of type situation. Like if they're licking all their wounds, they're trying to see whose allegiances lie where. They know that they've got these 3-4 renegade legions that are making their way all over the place. Let's just stuff them somewhere. Leman Russ isn't really content with just that. He wants to kill off the rest of his brother like some massive Game of Thrones victory moment where the board is wiped clean in the final 3 minutes of the second to last fucking episode of the season. You ever notice that? It's always the second to last. Moving on again. So Russ tasks the 13th Great Company with hunting down Ezekiel Abaddon in specific, as he's assumed the leadership of the Sons of Horus. He is the second hand of Horus himself. So the Sons of Horus are soon to become the Black Legion at this point. But off they go, disappearing into the warp, shouting Norse drinking songs and toasting the skulls of their enemy. Or at least that's kind of how I assume it went. Now, a lot of things happen in the lore after this point. Leman Russ mysteriously disappears from his legion, now called a chapter, during a grand feast. And there are a number of great hunts to go out and find him. But for the most part, we have not heard from him in the lore at this point. There's a lot of speculation that he'll be the next Primarch to return. The people say that's going to be Lionel Johnson. I don't care who it is, just send me another Primarch. I want that Primarch. Now, his spear was found and a number of other relics, but there might be a connection to the 13th Great Company. At least At least that's what the Marines of the 41st millennium believe. And there's a plate that is set for the missing 13th Wolf Lord during any grand feast. There's even a black stone set in the Grand Annals for the missing company. The Grand Annals, for those that don't know, is a record of each and every Space Wolf Great Company. So there's a lot of reverence reserved for the company that people haven't heard from in 10,000 years. Cue the 13th Black Crusade. Let's press the pause button real quick. Now you're thinking, okay, 10,000 years. They have to be whittled down to like two men at this point. Now, the way that time works in the warp, and we've discussed this before, we'll discuss this a lot when we talk about the Night Lords, but the way that the time works in the warp is way different. You might spend 4 years in the warp, it would be 2 minutes out in the real space. You might spend, 4 minutes in the warp, and it's 500 years in real space. So since there's that time, dilution, that's why you've got some Traitor Marines that have fought in the Siege of Terra. That's why you've got the 13th Great Company, who was, present during the Horus Heresy. So that's why this 10,000 year span is, while seemingly completely ridiculous and over the top, like, oh, come on, Games Workshop, don't hit me with the space opera 10,000 years here, but, well, it does kind of make a little bit of sense. That on top of it, everything's got the number 13 in it, so you take that as it is. So in some of the books that we hear about these legions that do kind of fare in the warp for 10,000 years, mainly the Traitor Legions, you don't hear about many loyalist companies, but we hear about them having to jerry-rig things, having to take pieces of armor from slain brothers or from stealing it that is armor from their own. So basically, the Traitor Legions kind of hodgepodge their suits of armor and maybe color it if they get the chance to. So we should see something similar to that with the 13th Great Company here. The 13th Great Company is going to have a smattering of different armor across different generations, different marks. So you're going to have, Mark 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, like armor pieces on these guys, because as they loot from as the traders loot from real space and bring it to the Eye of Terror and they fight the 13th Great Company, they're going to have that whole huge massive exchange of armor going on as things kind of just get looted across the board. So that's kind of, I wanted to kind of create an image here that this is not some sort of gleaming 13th Great Company in the Eye of Terror fighting off the Bastion, or fighting as like the final Bastion against Chaos. This is going to be a hodgepodge strike force that is constantly using guerrilla warfare tactics, doing everything they can to weaken the enemy in as little engagement as possible without prolonging their fights. So, again, cue the 13th Black Crusade. Let's press play here. The Lost Great Company returns to real space with the many incursions of Chaos, especially Abaddon himself. And this starts a different type of great hunt. This is the wolf hunt to bring back the wolfen into the fold, into the Emperor's light, into the Wolf of Fenrica. But it's mainly to hide from the Imperium's inquisitorial elements. The Space Wolves have always run that fine line with them as it is, and there are a number of times throughout the lore where the Inquisition and Space Wolves really butt heads here. And, seeing a roided out werewolf in Space Wolf armor would be, all the proof they needed to shout, "Heretic!" And really, that's where we're at in the lore. The 8th edition of Warhammer 40,000 really kicks off at the end of the Siege of Fenris, where Magnus and Mortarion waffle stomp the system into near oblivion. And this is a huge event that requires its own video, really. I mean, the Siege of Fenris has got so many, spanning situations. We see Fenris actually broken up into all the sorts of different geographical locations on the planet for the very first time in the 20-some-odd years of me reading all this stuff for the Space Wolves. So if you guys want to hear about the Siege of Fenris, let me know. We'll go into that. But the Space Wolves barely went out against the traitors, and they used the Spear of Rust to banish Magnus once more with the help of the Grey Knights and the Dark Angels, to name a few unlikely allies. But one of the biggest things they discover is that the mark of the Wolfen from the 13th Great Company is actually contagious, and it causes more and more Space Wolves to succumb to their curse. And it's interesting because in kind of the culmination of the final Siege of Fenris here, is that the Wolf Spear is created, which is a Primaris-only Space Wolf successor chapter, based off of course, the Khani's Helix, without the curse of the Wolfen being subjected to it. They do get they do kind of get the mark of the Wolfen, but they don't become werewolves. They just get super agitated in combat and they're way stronger. They don't basically become werewolves, is what I'm trying to say here. But it does make it out to be, especially at the end of the 8th edition, or I'm sorry, the beginning of the 8th edition, that the Space Wolves are in rampant decline as the curse of the wolfen is starting to spread throughout them. And the gene seed of the 13th Great Company has almost kind of changed here. So this is a good time to sidestep and go into some of the finer points of the 13th Great Company, starting with the mark of the wolfen, which we're talking about it. Now, we know that this is typically a randomly afflicted curse that typically triggers when a space wolf is in the neophyte stage, by whatever voodoo magic. The 13th Great Company can't necessarily control their curse, but they come and go by the mark's influence. So they go in and out of becoming a werewolf. So in their 10,000 year stint in the warp, the affliction has kind of come and gone, then came back again, meaning that there were never the same wolf and fighting in any engagement at any one time. They always were kind of changing and shifting as the mark would kind of shift its way through the company. In addition, the wolfen might use one or two wolfen that are on hand, but the 13th Great Company has large packs of them that fight as somewhat cohesive units. They're guided and shepherded by a wolf priest, but the 13th seem to have a slight better grasp and control of their wolfen curse than the random neophyte that falls victims during the trials of the wolf. But it does kind of mention that as a result of being in the warp for so long, this kind of creates a resistance to malign warp energies. The 13th Great Company as a whole is rather resistant to chaos magic and chaos influence. And the Inquisition kind of likes and doesn't like that, right? So you've got the overzealous elements of it that are like, you're using the might of chaos against them, hurrah! And the Puritans are, the Puritan inquisitorial elements are like, you're using the might of chaos, and sentence, you're dead, you're a heretic. So there's a very interesting dichotomy that goes on here with the 13th Great Company, and there's a lot of interest in elements of the Wolfen, of course, in the Inquisition, and also the Mechanicus. It's just this weird, interesting moment in the 8th edition where what the hell is the 13th Great Company going to spawn for the rest of the Space Wolves? Are they going to get their own book that's called the Wolfen, and it's just the elements of the Space Wolves that just kind of go insane, and then the Wolf Spear go on to make the rest of the Space Wolves? I hope to fucking God not, but get back on track. A lot of tangents today because there's a lot of interesting lore that intersects the 13th Great Company, so I apologize if I'm going all over the place here. Now, typically when we think of the Space Wolves, we think of the transition through the ranks, right? Bloodclaw is the initiate, the hot-tempered, impetuous, always eager to prove themselves for the route type of individual. Now, after a good, long time of temperance, when their fangs have grown and their hair has lost its long, vibrant color, they become Grey Hunters, the typical kind of tactical marine of the chapter. And from there, there's the progression up to the Wolf Guard, or even the Long Fangs. Each distinction has to do with age and placement as a veteran within the company and chapter as a whole. You can go on to become Wolf Guard Terminator. There's a bunch of different distinctions, but for the 13th, that doesn't really exist. Remember, these guys have been fighting the long fight for over 10,000 years. And the chapter of the 30th millennium, the chapters of the 30th millennium, were way larger than they are now. So without any fresh recruits, there are no Bloodclaws, and everyone in the chapter that isn't a higher rank is called a Grey Slayer. Now, these guys are leaps and bounds more experienced, deadly, and vicious than their kind of Grey Hunter counterpart, you could say. And I'd argue that the Grey Slayers are on the level of Wolf Guards as far as their martial abilities are concerned. Now, outside of that, there are the Stormclaws, which are the assault specialists, a little like Bloodclaws in that they're more hot-headed and aggressive than Grey Slayers, but by no means are they more quote-unquote green. Then you simply have the Wolf Lord, Rune Priests, and Wolf Priests. And there's an interesting sentiment here. Wolf Lords are in charge of companies, the Codex Astartes equivalent of chapters or captains. But one notion is that there are multiple Wolf Lords within the 13th Great Company, and that all fall under the Wolf Lord Jorn Bloodhowl, or Lord Bolvi. There are a lot of canon conflicts on this one, but there are multiple Jarls, such as Yalamar Stormfist. So let me backtrack here because I feel like this might be a bit confusing. So the 13th Great Company, you've got Stormclaws and Grey Slayers, followed by the ruling portions, Rune and Wolf Priests, followed by the Wolf Lord, if not multiple Wolf Lords under him, controlling elements of the Great Company. The way I would kind of think about it is that the Inquisition notes that the size of the Wolfen and elements of the 13th that are discovered during the 13th Black Crusade are really only small amounts what is possibly a larger force that's still embedded within the Eye of Terror on a separate mission. So you really have these guys that are a link to the past, and that's not a reference to one of my favorite Super Nintendo Zelda games. It's a reference to the 41st Millennium Space Wolves and the 30th Millennium Space Wolves, and how there is a very different portrayal of these guys, right? The 41st Millennium kind of looks at these guys and says, hey, you can help us find Leman Russ. How do we reconnect with our Primarch? Where is our Primarch? And the 13th Great Company is extremely hush-hush on everything. They don't want to divulge anything. They've been, for the most part, they're very want to even confirm their own history. So you see this kind of interesting, almost like a clandestine portion of the Space Wolves, and that they've probably been around the warp for so long that they don't even really think that they're in real space. They probably think it's some sort of trick. That's huge speculation here. But there's got to be a lot of mindfuckery that's going to go on as you spend the majority of your time in the Eye of Terror. There are times like the Storm of Chaos. There was another Black Crusade that happened, I think it might have been the 11th, in which Abaddon came into the world again, and through the Cadia Gate and on his way to Terra. But that was all retconned. That was some 4 or 5 years. No, God, actually no, it was like 10 years ago. I'm getting old. Like 10 years ago, and that's when the Wolfen first reappeared. They were in 3rd edition. They came back in like a 5th or 6th edition, and now they're back here again in 7th, 8th edition to stay as their own kind of permanent unit nowadays. So the future for the 13th Great Company is pretty interesting. Or a very interesting junction in the lore and in the editions of Warhammer 40,000. For the first time, we're seeing the story move forward at the end of 7th into 8th. And I think that 8th edition has really been the primer. Let's get everyone up to date with the new format for the way Warhammer 40,000 is going to be. 9th edition, I think, is going to be the real shit show. That's where we're going to lose a lot of special characters. We're going to get a bunch of different ones. We're going to get a whole new model range for probably some of them, and lose a whole bunch of old antiquated models. What the hell is wrong with me? We're going to lose a lot of old models. My point is here that the 13th Great Company is a staging point to possibly even remove the Space Wolves, or help cleanse the Space Wolf elements, just in the same way we saw the Devastation of Baal wipe out the majority of the Blood Angels. Maybe it was just Games Workshop's way of saying, okay, we need a way to diminish the strength of all these chapters to fill them with Primaris, without it being just some sort of chintzy way of saying, oh no, their gene seeds were corrupted, they're all dead. In a lot of ways, it kind of did do that. So maybe this is a way to push the Primaris above the normal Space Marine and eliminate those models. Which, to be totally honest with you, having now been painting both at the same, like side to side, I only like the Primaris models now. They're just so pretty. So we'll see what time what time really says for the 13th Great Company and the Space Wolves. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video here and got a better idea of who the 13th Great Company is. There is so much interesting lore around them because it is so intentionally mysterious, and it has such a direct connection, or possible direct connection, to Leman Russ himself. And I think when we see Leman Russ return as a Primarch in the tabletop, we're going to see the true story of what happens to the 13th Great Company. And when we do see that, I will hopefully do another follow-up video to that, because I've always found the 13th Great Company to be a really intriguing subject. In the previous editions, they just kind of had a small little blurb in the lore that was like, oh, we don't know what happened to the 13th Great Company. Some say they're lost forever. Like, oh, holy shit, these guys must be fucking badasses. And that's kind of how they're portrayed, right? So, again, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video here today, and it gave you a better idea of how the 13th Great Company operates in the world of Warhammer 40,000. But thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one, and take care.